February 3rd, 1945, 11:47 a.m. The air raid sirens began their wail across Berlin. From the reinforced observation window of the Führerbunker, General Oberst Hans Krebs stood motionless. His hand rested against the cold concrete wall. Outside, the winter sky had been pale and clear moments earlier. Now it was disappearing. They came from the west, first as distant specks, then as shadows, then as a formation so vast it seemed to pull the horizon inward. B-17 flying fortresses, hundreds of them. Their contrails wove a white lattice across the sky, layer upon layer, until the sun itself dimmed behind the aluminum and steel. Beside him, a junior officer whispered a count. He stopped at 200, then stopped counting altogether. Krebs had commanded armies. He had fought across Poland, France, and Russia. He had seen Wehrmacht divisions sweep across nations in weeks. He had believed, as they all had, that Germany possessed the finest military in the world. But no one had prepared him for this. The droning engines formed a single, unending thunder. The sky wasn't just filled with bombers, it was made of them. And in that moment, staring upward, Krebs understood something the German High Command had refused to believe for 3 years. America had built an air force larger than anything the world had ever seen. The war had not always looked like this. In September 1939, when German panzers rolled into Poland, the Luftwaffe owned the skies. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on Polish positions with terrifying precision. Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters swept aside resistance with ease. Within weeks, Poland had fallen. The world watched in shock as Germany demonstrated a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, and utterly dominant. By the spring of 1940, that dominance had only grown. France, the nation that had fought Germany to a standstill for 4 years in the previous war, collapsed in 6 weeks. The Luftwaffe destroyed French airfields, shattered supply lines, and provided close air support that turned battlefields into killing zones. British and French forces evacuated from Dunkirk under constant aerial assault. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, became a hero of the Reich. His air force seemed invincible. The Battle of Britain followed that summer. For months, German bombers and fighters hammered southern England. The goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, gain air superiority, and pave the way for invasion. The Luftwaffe came close. RAF Fighter Command bled pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate. But Britain held, barely. By October 1940, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. It was the Luftwaffe's first failure, but not a catastrophic one. Germany still controlled the skies over most of Europe. Then came Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. 3 million German soldiers poured into the Soviet Union. Once again, the Luftwaffe led the way. In the first days of the invasion, Soviet air forces were nearly annihilated on the ground. Thousands of aircraft destroyed before they could even take off. German fighters and bombers roamed freely over the Eastern Front, supporting the rapid advance towards Moscow. By autumn 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured millions of Soviet soldiers and seized vast territories. Victory seemed inevitable. During these years, German generals paid little attention to the United States. America had stayed out of the European war. Its military was small, outdated, and focused on hemisphere defense. The U.S. Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 3,000 aircraft in 1939, most of them trainers or obsolete models. American pilots had no combat experience. American industry produced cars and refrigerators, not warplanes. When German intelligence officers assessed potential threats, they rarely mentioned the United States. Why would they? America was an ocean away, politically divided, and militarily irrelevant. Even those who understood America's industrial capacity dismissed it as a factor. Germany's economy had been mobilized for war since the mid-1930s. Factories across the Reich produced tanks, artillery, and aircraft in carefully planned quantities. It worked. It had armed the most powerful military in the world. What could America possibly do that Germany hadn't already mastered? Build a few hundred bombers? Perhaps. But building aircraft was one thing. Training crews, developing tactics, and projecting power across an ocean, that required years, decades even. By then, the war would be over. This confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was rooted in experience. Germany had watched nations crumble before its military machine. The Luftwaffe had faced the French Armée de l'Air, the Royal Air Force, and the Soviet Air Forces and defeated or stalemated them all. What evidence existed that America could do better? None that German planners could see. Then, December 7, 1941 arrived. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. It was a decision that would change everything. When America entered the war, German leadership barely flinched. The United States was 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. It had no foothold in Europe. Its army numbered less than 2 million men, untested and poorly equipped by German standards. Its air forces were scattered across defensive positions in the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the continental United States. The idea that American bombers might one day darken the skies over Berlin seemed absurd. But something had already begun that German intelligence failed to grasp. It had started months before Pearl Harbor, in a quiet conversation between President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors. In May 1940, as France fell, Roosevelt addressed Congress. He called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year. Military officials thought it impossible. Aviation experts called it fantasy. America's entire aircraft industry had produced fewer than 6,000 planes the previous year. The infrastructure didn't exist. The workforce didn't exist. The factories didn't exist. Roosevelt didn't care. He told his advisors that America must become the arsenal of democracy. If Britain and the Soviet Union were to survive, they would need weapons, and America would provide them. He pushed Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, allowing the U.S. to supply allies with war materials. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, all of it flowing from American factories to allied nations. To make this happen, American industry transformed at a speed never seen before or since. Automobile plants retooled to build aircraft engines. Shipyards expanded to construct bombers on assembly lines. Small aviation companies became massive corporations overnight. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, North American. These names meant little in 1940. By 1943, they would be producing thousands of heavy bombers. The workforce changed just as rapidly. Millions of Americans, including hundreds of thousands of women, flooded into defense plants. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, representing the women who built B-17s, B-24s, and P-51 Mustangs on factory floors. Assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Production numbers climbed from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. By 1942, the United States was producing more aircraft than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. German intelligence received reports of this production surge. They dismissed them as Allied propaganda. The numbers seemed impossible. No nation could build 50,000 aircraft in a year, let alone 100,000. It had to be exaggeration, American duplicity, a psychological operation designed to demoralize the Reich. But the numbers were real. In 1941, American factories produced approximately 26,000 aircraft. In 1942, that number jumped to 47,000. In 1943, it reached 85,000. By 1944, American production peaked at over 96,000 aircraft in a single year. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, an endless stream of aluminum, steel, and firepower rolling off assembly lines and into the hands of Allied forces. While Germany produced around 40,000 aircraft in 1944, a respectable number by any measure, the United States alone built more than twice that. Add British and Soviet production, and the disparity became overwhelming. The Allies were outproducing the Axis by a margin of 4 or 5 to 1. But raw numbers meant nothing without a strategy to use them, and the United States Army Air Forces had a plan. It was called the Combined Bomber Offensive. The goal was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Destroy Germany's ability to wage war by bombing its industrial heartland into rubble. American bombers would strike by day, using the Norden bomb site for precision attacks on factories, refineries, and transportation networks. The RAF would bomb by night, targeting entire cities to break civilian morale and disrupt production. Together, they would rain destruction on the Third Reich until it could no longer sustain its military. The first American bombing raid over occupied Europe occurred on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses struck railway yards in Rouen, France. It was a small operation, a test run, but it marked the beginning of something far larger. Over the following months, the 8th Air Force, based in England, began flying deeper into German-held territory. Targets expanded from French coastal facilities to German industrial centers. Each raid involved more bombers, more fighter escorts, more tonnage of explosives dropped. The learning curve was steep. Early missions suffered heavy losses. German flak batteries and Luftwaffe interceptors tore into American formations. Bomber crews had life expectancies measured in missions, not months. But the Americans kept coming. For every bomber shot down, 2 more replaced it. For every crew lost, another graduated from training stateside. The pipeline of men and machines never stopped. German pilots, no matter how skilled, couldn't keep up. They were shooting down dozens of bombers, but hundreds more kept appearing. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Germany had entered a new phase. The skies belonged to whoever could afford to lose more, and America could afford to lose far more than Germany ever could. Building 300,000 warplanes was not a matter of blueprints and steel alone. It required a transformation of an entire society. When the United States entered World War II, it possessed roughly a dozen major aircraft manufacturing facilities. By 1944, that number had exploded to hundreds of plants, subcontractors, and assembly centers scattered across the nation. Willow Run, Michigan became home to a Ford-built factory over 3 million square feet in size, the largest room under one roof in the world at the time. At peak production, this single facility completed 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The logistics were staggering. A single B-17 Flying Fortress required over 400,000 individual parts. Wings built in one state, fuselages in another, engines in a third. Railway cars carried sub-assemblies across thousands of miles. Final assembly plants in Seattle, Long Beach, and Tulsa brought the pieces together. Workers, many of whom had never touched an aircraft before 1941, learned to rivet aluminum skin, install hydraulic systems, and wire electrical panels. Training programs condensed skills that once took years into weeks. Mistakes were common at first, but volume compensated. Planes rolled out faster than they could be flown away. Then came the technology itself. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed in the 1930s as a high-altitude, long-range bomber capable of defending itself. It carried 13.50 caliber machine guns mounted in turrets, waist positions, and nose compartments. Crews called it the Flying Fortress because it bristled with firepower. In theory, formations of B-17s could protect themselves against enemy fighters without needing escort. Early missions tested that theory. German FW-190s and Bf-109s proved otherwise. Bombers fell by the dozens. The solution arrived in 1943 with the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed for the British, the Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and could fly over 1,500 miles with drop tanks, far enough to escort bombers deep into Germany and back. Equipped with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the P-51 became the finest fighter aircraft of the war. German pilots, accustomed to attacking unescorted bomber formations, now faced American fighters that could outperform anything the Luftwaffe fielded. By mid-1944, P-51s roamed the skies over Berlin itself. The era of German air superiority was over. Behind every aircraft was a human story. American air crews trained in the vast airspaces of Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. Bomber pilots learned formation flying, navigation, and how to hold steady through flak. Gunners practiced tracking fast-moving targets. Bombardiers spent hours over Norden bomb sites, learning to release payloads from 25,000 feet with precision. The training was intense, but it was never enough. Nothing prepared them for the reality of combat over Germany. A typical bombing mission into the heart of the Reich lasted 8 to 10 hours. Crews woke before dawn, attended briefings where target maps and flak projections were revealed. They dressed in heated flight suits. Temperatures at altitude reached 40 degrees below zero. They climbed into bombers that smelled of oil, metal, and fear. Then they flew. Hours of formation flying over the English Channel and occupied France. Then the German border. Then the flak. Black clouds of exploding anti-aircraft shells that filled the sky with jagged steel fragments. Then the fighters. Messerschmitts diving through formations, cannons blazing, bombers exploding mid-air, parachutes blossoming. Some men made it home, many did not. The 8th Air Force suffered a 26% casualty rate over the course of the war, higher than any other American unit except the Marine Corps. Of roughly 350,000 airmen who served, over 26,000 were killed in action. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. To complete a tour of duty, a crew had to survive 25 missions, later raised to 35. Statistically, most crews didn't make it, and yet they kept flying. Every morning, new missions. Every day, more targets. From the German side, the American bomber offensive initially seemed manageable. Luftwaffe intelligence tracked the buildup of 8th Air Force strength in England throughout 1942 and early 1943. Reports noted increasing numbers of B-17s and B-24s stationed at bases across East Anglia. Fighter groups equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing. The threat was real, but not yet existential. German air defenses remained formidable. Flak batteries ringed every major city and industrial center. Luftwaffe fighter wings, though stretched thin for commitments in the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, still possessed skilled pilots and effective aircraft. Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, reassured Hitler repeatedly. The bombing campaign would fail, he insisted, just as the British bombing campaign had failed to break German morale. Production would continue. The Reich would endure. Göring promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. It was a promise he could not keep. German intelligence made a critical miscalculation. They underestimated not just the scale of American production, but the willingness of the United States to sustain losses. When early raids in 1943 resulted in heavy casualties, 10% or more of attacking bombers shot down on some missions, Luftwaffe commanders believed they had found the answer. Inflict enough pain and the Americans would stop coming. After the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, where 60 bombers were lost in a single day, German officers celebrated. Surely this would be the end of daylight bombing. It was not. The raids continued. Larger formations, better tactics, and then, in early 1944, the P-51 Mustangs arrived in force. German fighter pilots who once hunted bombers with impunity now found themselves hunted by Mustangs. The Mustangs didn't just escort bombers, they pursued German fighters back to their airfields and strafed them on the ground. German losses, which had been sustainable in 1943, became catastrophic in 1944. Meanwhile, the strategic doctrine of daylight precision bombing revealed its complexity. American planners believed that by targeting specific industries, ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, they could cripple Germany's war machine without resorting to the indiscriminate city bombing campaigns favored by the RAF. The Norden bomb site was supposed to allow bombardiers to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In practice, weather, flak, and human error made true precision nearly impossible. Many bombs fell wide of their targets. Entire neighborhoods vanished in the explosions meant for nearby factories. This raised moral questions that air crews and commanders grappled with, though rarely publicly. Were they liberators or destroyers? The official line was clear. They were attacking military and industrial targets, weakening Germany's ability to wage war. Civilian casualties were regrettable but unavoidable. The crews dropped their bombs, watched the explosions below, and tried not to think too hard about what or who was burning. German civilians experienced the war from below. Air raid sirens became a constant presence. Families spent nights in basements and bunkers. Children grew up knowing the sound of bombers before they knew nursery rhymes. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and later Berlin, entire districts were reduced to ash. Firestorms consumed neighborhoods in minutes. Tens of thousands died. Survivors wandered through rubble-choked streets, searching for relatives, food, shelter, anything. The psychological toll was immense. And yet, German war production didn't collapse. Factories were rebuilt, often underground. Workers continued reporting for shifts. The Nazi regime, through a combination of propaganda, terror, and sheer organizational efficiency, kept the war machine functioning far longer than Allied planners expected. But there was a breaking point, and in the winter of 1944, it was rapidly approaching. February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, later known as the Big Week. Over 6 days, American and British bombers flew nearly 6,000 sorties against German aircraft production facilities. Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, Stuttgart. Factories that produced Bf-109s and Fw-190s were pounded into wreckage. The Luftwaffe rose to meet the attacks. German fighters swarmed the bomber formations. Flak batteries fired until their barrels overheated. Over the course of the week, the Luftwaffe shot down 226 American bombers and 28 fighters. But the Germans lost 300 fighters. More importantly, they lost the pilots flying them. Experienced fighter aces, men who had flown since the invasion of Poland, died in burning cockpits over their own homeland. Replacements existed, but they were young, poorly trained, and flying into a sky dominated by enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe could replace aircraft. It could not replace experienced pilots. Big Week shattered the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. In the months that followed, American bombers roamed with increasing freedom. Formations grew larger. German generals stood in command posts and watched through periscopes and observation slits. They saw what Hermann Göring had promised would never happen. The sky over Berlin belonged to the enemy, and there was nothing left to stop it. When the bombs finally stopped falling, the silence was almost worse than the noise. Berlin in early 1945 was a graveyard of a city. Entire streets had ceased to exist. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their facades intact, but their interiors gutted by fire. Rubble filled roads. Water mains burst, flooding basements where survivors still hid. Gas leaks created invisible death traps. Electrical lines hung loose, sparking in the wreckage. The smell. Burning wood, melted rubber, decomposing bodies clung to everything. The numbers told part of the story. By the war's end, Allied bombers had dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Europe. Roughly half of that tonnage on Germany itself. Berlin alone absorbed over 45,000 tons of bombs from American and British raids combined. Entire city blocks were reduced to dust. Of Berlin's pre-war population of 4.3 million, over half had fled or been evacuated by early 1945. Those who remained lived in cellars, subway tunnels, and makeshift shelters carved from ruins. But statistics could not capture what the bombing campaign had done to German morale. For years, Nazi propaganda had assured the population that Germany was winning, that the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, that Allied bombers were being shot down in droves. Newsreels showed flak batteries firing, German fighters attacking, enemy planes spiraling to earth in flames. The message was clear: Germany was invincible. Then, the bombs kept falling, and people stopped believing. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed, not in a single catastrophic battle, but through relentless attrition. In 1943, Germany produced approximately 25,000 aircraft. In 1944, despite Allied bombing, production actually increased to around 40,000. But it didn't matter. The Luftwaffe couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace losses. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons, and by early 1945, thousands of newly built fighters sat unused on airfields, waiting for pilots and fuel that would never arrive. Allied air supremacy extended beyond bombers. American and British fighters hunted anything that moved. German trains were strafed on railways, trucks destroyed on roads. Even individual soldiers were targets for roving fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe's once proud fighter wings were reduced to desperate last stands. Jets like the Me-262, technologically superior to anything the Allies fielded, appeared too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. German pilots flew suicide missions, ramming bombers when their ammunition ran out. Nothing worked. The economic impact was equally devastating. Germany's war production, despite heroic efforts to decentralize and protect factories, declined sharply in late 1944 and early 1945. Oil refineries, targeted relentlessly by American bombers, could no longer supply the fuel needed for tanks, aircraft, and vehicles. By the final months of the war, German panzers sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. Aircraft remained grounded. The vaunted Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe, was reduced to horse-drawn transport and foot marches. Transportation networks collapsed under the bombing. Railroads, the arteries of German logistics, were smashed beyond repair. Bridges were destroyed, marshalling yards obliterated. Goods that once moved efficiently across the Reich now piled up uselessly in warehouses, or never moved at all. Food distribution broke down. Civilian rations, already meager, became starvation level in many cities. The German economy, which had sustained 4 years of total war, finally buckled. For the men who had commanded the Luftwaffe, the end was bitter. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor and the architect of German air power, became a figure of ridicule and scorn. His promises had proven hollow. His reassurances had been lies. By 1945, he was addicted to morphine, isolated from command, and ignored by Hitler. When the war ended, he surrendered to American forces, still wearing his flamboyant uniforms and medals. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes and sentenced to death. He committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution. Other Luftwaffe commanders fared no better. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest fighter aces, spent the final months of the war commanding a jet fighter squadron in hopeless missions against overwhelming Allied numbers. After the war, he admitted that the Luftwaffe had been defeated not by superior tactics, but by sheer industrial output. Germany simply could not build aircraft fast enough to replace losses. America could. Post-war interrogations of German officers revealed a consistent theme: shock at the scale of American production. Many had believed the intelligence reports were exaggerated. When they saw the bomber streams with their own eyes, formations stretching for miles, they realized the truth. One captured general, asked when he knew Germany would lose the war, answered simply, "When I saw how many planes you had." The human cost was staggering on all sides. American bomber crews suffered over 26,000 killed and 28,000 captured. British Bomber Command lost 55,000 aircrew. German civilians killed in bombing raids numbered between 400,000 and 600,000. Exact figures remain disputed. Luftwaffe pilots and aircrew losses exceeded 100,000. Cities across Germany lay in ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Names that once represented culture and history became synonyms for destruction. The strategic bombing campaign remains controversial among historians. Did it shorten the war? Certainly. By how much? That question has no clear answer. Did it break German morale? Not entirely. Production continued until the final weeks. Did it save Allied lives by crippling German war industry? Almost certainly. Would an invasion of Germany have been possible without air superiority? No credible military historian believes so. But the bombing campaign also revealed the dark logic of total war. Once begun, escalation was inevitable. Early precision raids gave way to area bombing. Military targets blurred into civilian ones. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant eroded. The goal was no longer just to destroy factories, but to break the will of an entire nation. And the tools to do so, hundreds of thousands of bombs dropped from hundreds of thousands of aircraft, were wielded without hesitation. The legacy of the air war shaped everything that followed. The United States emerged from World War II with the most powerful air force on Earth. Strategic bombing became a cornerstone of American military doctrine, influencing conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq. The B-17, B-24, and B-29 gave way to B-52s, stealth bombers, and eventually drones. But the principle remained: control the skies and you control the war. For Germany, the lesson was different. The Luftwaffe's defeat proved that technological skill and tactical brilliance meant nothing without industrial capacity to sustain them. Germany had produced excellent aircraft and trained superb pilots, but it could not match the output of American factories or replace losses at the rate America could. In the arithmetic of total war, Germany lost. The sky over Berlin, once the symbol of Nazi power, had become the symbol of Nazi defeat. The contrails of American bombers, stretching from horizon to horizon, marked the end of the Third Reich as surely as Soviet tanks entering the city weeks later. The air war was not the only reason Germany lost, but without it, victory would have been impossible. The war ended in May 1945. The bombers stopped flying. The sirens fell silent. Across Europe, the skies cleared. In the years that followed, survivors of the air campaign, American, British, German, struggled to explain what they had witnessed. Veterans spoke of it in quiet tones, if they spoke of it at all. The scale was too vast for easy comprehension, the numbers too large. 300,000 aircraft, millions of tons of bombs, hundreds of thousands dead. What remained was a lesson written in fire and steel across the skies of Europe, that industrial power, when fully mobilized, could reshape the world. That nations willing to turn their entire economies toward war could produce forces of unimaginable scale. That the age of small professional armies and limited conflicts had ended forever. The German generals who stood in bunkers beneath Berlin, watching the sky turn black with bombers, had learned that lesson too late. They had underestimated America, not its courage, but its capacity. They had fought brilliantly, innovated desperately, and resisted fanatically. But they could not overcome the simple, brutal mathematics of production. For every plane Germany built, America built 5. For every pilot Germany trained, America trained 10. And when Germany's factories lay in ruins and its fuel reserves ran dry, American factories were still running, still building, still sending endless streams of aircraft across the Atlantic. The sky over Berlin had turned black not because of weather or smoke, but because an entire ocean away, a nation had decided to build an air force large enough to darken the heavens. And once that decision was made, no amount of skill or courage or desperation could prevent what followed. The bombers came, and they kept coming, until there was nothing left to bomb.